Good day, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lilly with the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Nuclear for Electricity Generation, French and German Energy Policy Choices. We are grateful to our moderators, Yannick Perez and Eric Patinkio, for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues amongst professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations along with a host of other products and services that you can find on our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for the panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We have allocated time at the end of the webinar to read and answer them. And now, I would like to introduce you to our moderators. Yannick Perez is Professor in Economics of Energy and Mobility at the University of Paris-Sud, and Aaron Patinkio is Professor of Energy System Economics at RWTH Aachen University. We also wish to thank both FAEE and GEE for sponsoring this webinar today. Yannick, over to you. Yannick?
Yannick, I think you can introduce the French Association briefly if you like.
I think he may not be able to hear. You go ahead and I will message him. If
All
you could,
right.
Aaron.
Take the opportunity to welcome you also from the side of GE being the German affiliate of the IAEE. And it gives me great pleasure to host this presentation and this event jointly with our French sister organization, FAEE. And I think the topic is very timely, talking about nuclear energy with what's been going on with the discussions on the European Commission's level, labeling nuclear energy as sustainable. So the GE has actually 3 goals. The first one being politically neutral, second one being a platform for interdisciplinary exchanges, and the third goal being a platform for exchanges on an international level, not only the German level. And traditionally, since its foundation in 1981, the GE has been doing exactly that, offering a platform for controversial yet respectful debates and exchanges on energy topics. And we're very happy that we are able to talk about such a controversial topic, which is nuclear energy, together with our French colleagues. And with that being said, over to you, Yannick.
Okay, thank you very much, Aaron. Sorry for the beginning of the session. I don't know, I have no ear back, so sorry. So thank you very much, Dave, for opening this discussion, and Aaron for introducing the German Association for Energy Economists. There is no more debatable topic between France and Germany than nuclear. So we are quite happy to have 3 German colleagues speaking with 3 German economists together, because it will be very interesting to see an academic debate on these issues and not a fight of strange arguments, but let's say research-based results and perspectives and scenarios, and let's try to put some rationality in the debate. And both Arthur and Vincent are trying to do that in the French context, which is really pro-nuclear. And I'm pretty sure that our German friends are doing the same in a different environment, and the confrontation of the two approaches will bring light. I'm pretty sure about that. So now I let the floor to the first speaker, and I'm quite sure we will have a lot of questions. So I think you are the first to speak, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I will take over just a second.
Okay.
I'm going to share my screen. So, can you see it now? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Yes, my name is Munib Amin. I'm working at E.ON in a department called Research and Technology, where we are responsible especially for academic contacts, for common research and for technological assessments. But today I'm going to talk about nuclear power in Germany, how it all began and how it's all ending now. And basically my goal for this talk is to show why the development in Germany is so different from the development in other countries, like, for example, France, and what the historical reasons are for that. I will guide you through the development of nuclear in Germany, and then you will see the decisive points where in Germany other decisions were made than in other countries. But why me? I'm not in nuclear anymore, but I used to be. I used to be at RWE when the most important decisions were made concerning first lifetime extension, and then after the accident at Fukushima, the more restricted phase-out policy in Germany. And at that time, I did a lot of executive support. I was in a staff department, and I was also executive support manager. And so it was a pretty stressful time, but it was also a very interesting and an intense experience. And hopefully I can share a little bit of that today. And I have to say, I'm not a historian, I'm a physicist. And so what I'm telling you is mostly from memory. And so forgive me if it's a bit, not as, let's say, neutral as a historian would do. But starting at the very early beginnings of nuclear in Germany, I would like to say that Germany used to be a front runner in the development of nuclear technologies and nuclear sciences. So I just gave you one example, which is the pebble bed reactor, which was a design that was pushed forward in Germany. And even though the implementation of that design was not, in the end, not successful, as you can see in the middle picture, it still influences the industry today. And China has just commissioned a pebble bed reactor in the last year. And they say it's first of its kind, but actually it was done before, especially also in Germany. And it was not only the science, it was also the industrial development of nuclear power, and the commercial use of nuclear power started in the 1960s. But it was not completely without obstacles. For example, RWE was reluctant to enter nuclear power. It was we have some historical documents that show that the company was afraid that the overall costs of nuclear energy could not be calculated. And so they actually didn't want to enter nuclear power in the first place, but they were pushed by politics. And so they entered this technology, and also a decent number of nuclear power plants were built in the 1960s and 70s. in Germany. But the decisive point basically came in the 70s in the wake of the oil crisis from 1973. And at that time, there were plans for a massive expansion of nuclear power in Germany. Here you can see former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, and his rationale was basically that we would have to go away from oil because of the dependence from imports. And you can see what he said in 1979 here: the burning of any kind of hydrocarbons leads to a dangerous heating of the globe. So he was against the extended use of coal, and he also said that the development of renewable energy sources would not be feasible in the forthcoming 30 years. And so he said in 2010, we will no longer have oil, then all cars will run on batteries. For that, we need nuclear power plants so that we can charge the batteries from the socket. And it's really astonishing how similar these arguments from that time are to the arguments that we have today. But you have to take into account that at that time, at the end of the 70s, that must have sounded a bit like science fiction to the people. And so that was some kind of a really intellectual point of view of things. But it was not science fiction. The technology was already there. At that time in Germany, we developed the so-called convoy models. This is a special line of nuclear power plants, which was highly standardized, super reliable, and also very flexible. And this, I mean, it was called convoy because it was planned to build a lot of these power plants in a row. And these power plants would have been able to do the job, basically, to have an extension of nuclear power like it was done in France. And also the 3 remaining nuclear power plants in Germany that are still running today are these 3 convoy plants that have actually been built. And as I said, they are really reliable. And for example, curiously, RWE had one of these plants, and I was never there because we, from the central offices, we only showed up when there was an issue, and at that plant there was never an issue. So it was just super reliable and also could handle flexible operation. But as you know, these plans were not implemented. And why didn't it happen? In the 1980s, skepticism grew in Germany, just like in other countries. But in Germany, it was somewhat more severe than in other countries. In 1979, as you probably know, there was a 3 Mile Island accident in the United States. And at that time was also the formation of the Green Party in Germany in 1979 and 1980. And in 1968, there was the Chernobyl accident. And at that time, there was a growing atmosphere of mistrust. What we saw that there was a gap developing between supporters and anti-nuclear activists. So on the one hand, you had these elites of politicians, people from industry and from science. And on the other side, you had this grassroots development. And the people from this grassroots development were not really seen as equals in the discussion because they were no expert. And that caused really, let's say, this trench to grow, and we had this polarization in Germany. And for example, as you can see here on this image from 1968, where, for example, excessive police force was was applied to activists. And from today's point of view, this image looks really disturbing. But it also shows how the polarization in the society grew. And that was a mistake. It was also that when I started working in the nuclear industry, that even the president of the nuclear lobby organization at that time gave a speech where he said that was actually a mistake to let this happen, to have this polarization where you are divided into this group of experts and this group of activists, basically. That would not really then talk to each other anymore. And that was the atmosphere where things went into another direction than, for example, in France. So when the Green Party was then in the federal government for the first time in 1998, it was then finally negotiated how the nuclear phase out in Germany could be done. So at that time, the government put a lot of pressure on the nuclear operators because the government could have prevented continuing operation of nuclear power plants just by not giving permits, for example, for nuclear waste transport. So they could have just stopped the operation by not giving permits. And that, of course, put a lot of pressure to have finally this consensus negotiated with the nuclear operators. And this consensus was actually quite a piece of work. It was a smart idea to do it in the following way. The power plants in Germany received a certain amount of electricity that they were still allowed to produce until the end of their operation. So each plant could produce a certain amount of electricity, and when this electricity was used up, it would automatically lose its permit for power operation, and then it was over. And that could not be, that was more or less irreversible, because applying for a new permit for an old plant is usually not possible. So once you lose your permit, it's over. And this plan gave the operators of nuclear power plants some security for their operation, but also some flexibility, because to some degree you could shift some of these amounts of electricity from one plant to another. So that was the situation in 2002, and here you can see the projected lifetimes for the individual plants. And that was basically it. The decision was made that Germany would go out of nuclear, and it was not really seriously questioned afterwards. So it was only that, as we see in the next chapter, that the government changed over time, and at some point decided to have a lifetime extension. So just to buy a little more time for the nuclear power plants in Germany. And the idea was never to revive the nuclear industry in Germany or to build new plants. It was just to make the transition into a renewable future easier for three reasons, basically. The first one being you have the nuclear power plants would facilitate CO2-free production of electricity. Second one, they could keep the electricity prices at bay to some degree. And the third one is that the extra profits from the continuation of the operation of the nuclear power plants could partially be used to to finance support for renewable projects or for climate protection projects. So parts of these, about half of the additional profits would have been transferred to the government, to governmental funds, and these funds could have been used for climate protection purposes. So that was the idea, just to facilitate this transition. And that was also the time when I started in the nuclear industry. So as you probably all know, these plans didn't work out, because the next thing that happened was in 2011, where a severe nuclear accident happened in Fukushima in Japan. And the thing was, just to briefly remind you, there was a tsunami at the coast in front of Japan, and it flooded basically the Fukushima site, and there was a loss of power, which in turn caused a catastrophic accident of the site. And this also had a severe impact on what happened in Germany, and we discussed it a lot, and we took a close look at it. And what I found remarkable was, at that time, when I talked to experts in nuclear safety, they were not so super surprised that something like that could happen in Japan, because there had been issues before in Japan that were connected to safety culture. And also, when we did some analysis on this accident, we found out that the operator in Japan, TEPCO, didn't really play by the book. So there were severe design flaws of this facility that could have been identified. And so it was actually a mistake of the operator of that plant. And so the question was, how did that affect Germany? And it did, although obviously we do not have tsunamis in Germany. There was a perceived urge to do something about nuclear energy in Germany as well. And the immediate action of the authorities and the government was that they halted the operation of 8 nuclear power plants, which was called atomic moratorium, if you like, and it did a safety assessment of all of the nuclear power plants in Germany. Of course, it was something that was actually surprising that you would halt the operation of nuclear power plants in Germany because of an accident that happened in Japan that was not transferable. But at that time, it was like this, and these 8 power plants didn't start operation again because there was a new legislation and a renewed law, atomic nuclear. No, it was a renewal of the Atomic German Act, which then fixed the dates of the shutdown of the individual power plants. And so it doesn't look really severe on this graphic, where you see the red lines with the fixed dates when you compare them to the old regulation. But it did cut off some of the time that we would have had for the operation of the nuclear power plants, and also devaluated some of the investments into the nuclear power plants. And of course, it's a severe change with respect to the lifetime extension. And here you can also see that only these 3 power plants are still operational, because the other ones all have been shut down. And that was basically it. The decision was made, and public interest declined very fast. activists focused on other topics. I always find this graphic so shocking. When you take a look at Google Trends for atom, I usually use the word atom because that's the word that non-experts use when they Google something connected to nuclear energy. And you see this spike and then nothing. It's just a noise after that. And so the activists focused on other topics, especially on lignite in Germany, and you could see it really very fast that they changed from one side to the other side, and there was this occupation at the open cast lignite mining plant. And this, of course, is an ongoing topic in Germany. Yes, so that was it basically for, let's say, the wild days of nuclear power in Germany. And so the dust has settled more or less. And in Germany, we already have sorted out most of the connected problems. So the utilities have adapted their organizational structure already with respect to remaining operation, decommissioning, and dismantling. Then the financial responsibility for the disposal of nuclear waste was transferred to the federal government through a one-off payment. And so that is now secure for the operators. And the process for the preparation of a final nuclear waste storage was defined by law and also by a commission, and this process is now being executed. Of course, it takes some time, but at least we have a process to do that. And also compensations for the nuclear operators have been regulated by court rulings, by legal adjustment, and last year, finally, by an agreement for a payment of 2.5 billion euros, which was then basically the end of the story. And so that's it. Things all have been regulated, and just as I said, the wild days are over, and it is now all becoming a bit calmer about this nuclear discussion, because in principle we have sorted out most of the problems. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. There is a question in the chat.
Yes, there is a question for you.
Yeah. So the first question is, does the decision in 2002 reflect hopes that gas would be the fuel of the future without being fully aware at that time of the climate change? That's difficult to say, because when the Green Party was part of the government, it was clearly one of their goals just to get out of nuclear. There was not so much of a rationale around it, I believe. It was clear at that time that fossil fuels would be increased in use, but the Green Party had one of their main goals just to get out of nuclear in the first place. If there's anybody else from the round who would complement that question, but I from my point of view, it was like that 20 years ago.
Maybe just briefly for organizational matters, after each presentation, we will have 1 or 2 minutes for short questions of understanding, only related to the direct presentation. And at the end of all 4 presentations, we are going to have joint discussions. But please feel free to collect all the questions until then, to just write them down. And maybe also we will later have a presentation from Yannick. Maybe he can also comment on some of the questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Very good.
Should I continue? There's another comment. It said.
Maybe it's better to wait the discussion time for the second question.
Okay.
Okay. So Vincent, I think it's
Thanks very much, Monique, for your interesting presentation and the insights.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I will share my screen. Is it okay?
Yes.
Yes. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to present the French context, all the more that it's very topical right now. Well, for different reasons, this question about the energy pathways are now lively debated in France. And in RTE, we have just published a study about energy pathways to 2050. And I will present it to you as a head of energy studies, economic studies, excuse me, at RTE. So just to give you, first of all, the broad scene in France. Well, we have two major topics to 2050 and for the decarbonation of energy and let's say the questions for the electricity systems. So first of all, for the decarbonation of energy in France, it's framed by an official document, which is the National Low Carbon Strategy, which was defined by the government several years ago. And one of the, if not the main conclusion of this document is that in order to reach decarbonation of our economy in France, considering the situation we have right now, I would just add a pointer in order. So the situation we have right now, which a major share of our energy, which is provided by fossil fuels, and quite a high share of a high amount of energy consumed, 1,600 terawatt hours of energy consumed in France. In order to reach decarbonation, we will need to reduce energy consumed by 2050 for several reasons. One of the main one is that the amount of biomass available and that could be used for energy purposes is limited. And because of that, that's limits quite a lot the amounts of energy available. And also, even if we could rely on electricity and on other resources, other than biomass, it triggers other questions, in particular in terms of acceptability of energy infrastructure. And this is why it's needs also to be this amount of energy need to be settled. The work we have conducted, the prospective analysis we have conducted, we have relied on this framework. It could be discussed, it will be revised in the coming years. So this for sure will be discussed, but nevertheless, that's the framework we have worked in and that we will discuss today. So a major decrease of total energy demand in France, which is expected. That's not the specific figure which is important, but nevertheless, that's the major framework for it. So that's the first challenge, which is to decrease this amount. And as you can notice, there is one important share of type of energy which is called to increase, which is the share of electricity. There's also a question with regard biomass, but well, as the French TSO, the French electricity TSO, and since we are in charge of the question of security of supply in our system, we need to look at this question of the share of electricity, which is largely expected to increase so we are in a situation where the overall amount of energy is called to decrease, but the overall amount of electricity consumed is called to increase by more than 1/3. So that's the very first challenge for the electricity system. The second challenge, which is related to the very topic of today, is the replacement of the second generation nuclear reactors that we have in France. They were mainly built in the 80s, during the decade between the 80s and the 90s, as you can see here. So you have a graph with the installed nuclear capacity in France, which is some kind of sigmoid function. And if we take into account that these generators could have a lifetime for 50 years or 60 years, which is the two dotted lines that you can see here, it's quite obvious that in 2050, or even if you look at the longer term again in 2060, there is the question of the replacement of this nuclear fleet, and the question of with which type of capacity we will need to replace this very capacity, which stands today for 60% of the energy of the electricity, produced in France. So, which is a major lever of decarbonation of electricity right now, and also in the future, when we consider that other energy use could be decarbonized, could be decarbonized by electrification. So we have conducted a study that we published recently in October last year. So looking at very different analysis axes, technical, economic, environmental, society. I will focus today on the question of a bit of technical, a bit of economic. It was a work conducted under a wide consultation process with more than 100 organizations represented, with a lot of technical and plenary meetings. For the moment, it's available in French, but the executive summary is being translated and should be available in English and also possibly in German quite soon. So just to give you a broad overview of the model, and possibly if there is question later on, I could enter more into the detail, but the way we have processed, so we have made a European model, which is a classical model that TSOs use in Europe for our security of supply analysis, which is a simulation of supply-demand balance on an hourly basis, and also taking into account that we need to have an economic efficient investment, in particular in flexible capacities. And this model is fed with a different set of assumptions and data. We simulate 200 methodological scenarios, different methodological scenarios for each studied years. So 2030, 2040, 2050, 2060. Also taking into account different patterns of climate change. So for testing for the reliability of the system with regard to climate change. This allows to have different hourly patterns for renewable energy production, for photovoltaic production, for wind production, and also in coherence with the power load pattern. So taking into account the impact, for instance, of temperature on the consumption, and also taking into account that you have planned but also forced outages of power plants that are also simulated, and also taking into account that you have several possibilities of flexibility for generators, quite classical generators, but also batteries, sector coupling with electrolyzers. And all this simulated on modeled European power system, even if we focus on the case of France, and we also have analyzed the impact on the system, on the network needs, in particular internally for the case of France. And thanks to this analysis, we could have an analysis on different dimensions for technical dimension, economical dimension, but also environmental dimension. I will focus on technical and economical dimensions. So for consumption, I already mentioned it previously. So we built the trajectory. It's not something that we decide. It's a bottom-up analysis, analyzing the different usage of electricity and how we can evaluate in time, considering in particular energy efficiency, but also electrification. And because in particular, because of electrification of different sectors of mobility, but also of higher electrification of industry, but also for the production of hydrogen, we see what was mentioned previously, an increase of electricity consumption, which is shared in the whole French energy stakeholders, an increase compared to today by 1/3 in the baseline trajectory. If we also take into account sufficiency measures, we still see an increase in the power load compared to today. Today we are around 480 terawatt-hours, so it's an increase of 70 terawatt-hours or something like that. But nevertheless, it's limited compared to the other situation, and we have considered sufficiency measures in all the different sectors. We have also considering the different the policy debate about reindustrialization, a case where we will have a reindustrialization of the French economy. And this would increase again the electricity consumption by 100 terawatt-hours to reach 750 terawatt-hours, which a share of industry that would be in the range higher than 10%, which is quite considerable, even if let's say the absolute figure is not important, but considering to today and even the trend of the tertiarization of economy, it's significant. So this is, let's say, takeaways that I've already mentioned, that for reducing consumption, well, it will be needed to rely on energy efficiency and also possibly on energy sufficiency in order to reach the climate targets. The energy consumption will decrease, but the electricity consumption will increase. And if we accelerate French reindustrialization, mechanically, it will increase electricity consumption, but at the same time, it would reduce the carbon footprint, avoiding CO2 emissions elsewhere in the world. So for the transformation of the mix, the whole consultation process leads us to consider two types of scenarios and three scenarios for each. So scenarios in which we end up without new nuclear, and so at the end there would be 100% renewable, either in 2050 or in 2060, but with different mix of renewable. As you can see, this mix of renewable is rely more on PV, in particular on distributed PV here, whereas the other renewable mix here rather rely on large power plants. And the other set of scenarios is scenarios in which part of the existing nuclear fleet is replaced by new nuclear reactors. I insist part of it, you will see that we do not replace all the existing nuclear capacity, even in these scenarios that include new nuclear reactors. So just to give you a broader understanding of those scenarios, so we have different trajectories. In particular, I will begin with the higher level of nuclear capacity that is expected to be installed. You have, just to give you an idea, here is the historical nuclear power development that was experienced by the French power system, just to give you an idea of comparison with this trajectory. So this higher trajectory could be seen not very high, but nevertheless, that was the industrial capacity that the nuclear actors said was feasible, the higher capacity feasible. So we have taken it. At the end, it ends up that by 2050, it would stand for 50% of the electricity mix, but it was not the target reached or the target researched. That's a consequence of the industrial constraints that the nuclear actors said us would be reasonable, considering that their ability to develop capacity. And then we have the two other trajectories, and we end up with a share of renewable then that is between let's say 25 and 60% and 50%, sorry, for nuclear capacity. And then, considering these scenarios and the need for electricity consumption, in all of those scenarios, we need renewable in order to have the overall balance. Now, if we focus on the renewable scenarios, here, what is important is to compare the required renewable development rates with historical rates, either in France or elsewhere in Europe. So that's what is illustrated here. So you have photovoltaic, onshore wind, offshore wind, and you have the required development rates in the different scenarios. And compared with the historical development. Sorry, I don't see completely because of Doom this part. And what you can see here, what is very important, is that in order to reach the required development rate for renewable, well, we will have to reach, on average, some of the development rates that were historical records, either in France or in other countries, depending on the scenarios we are considering. So this means that it will be very demanding in terms of renewable development in those scenarios. That's quite obvious, but now it's quite important to mention it with significant measures, with concrete measures. So I've already mentioned those two conclusions, and just to conclude, if I still have a bit of time, just to give you an idea of the economic analysis we have conducted on those scenarios. So taking the figures for 2060. So we have compared the scenarios on different dimensions. So first of all, we have compared the overall production cost, considering renewable and nuclear only and disregarding other matters. Then, if we compare the different scenarios, we see that in particular this renewable scenario, M23, well, is cheapest than the other scenarios with nuclear. But in this scenario, we don't take into account that we need flexibility in order to cope with the variability of renewable. When we take that into account, this flexibility, so the need to have peakers, the need to have batteries, things like that, and also the fact that we need to have energy to run them, or this energy coming in particular from electrolysis of water in order to have hydrogen. When we add up the cost of flexibility, the story is completely different, because even this scenario, which was the cheapest, just looking at the cost of decarbonized production, when we take into account the cost of flexibility, well, the nuclear scenarios are more interesting, because you are with dispatchable generators that requires less flexibility. And then it's less costly in this situation to have nuclear in your overall mix. And if you add up, if you add up the cost of the network, not only the transmission cost but also the distribution cost, because the whole analysis have included also the cost of the network. Well, the conclusion we had previously with flexibility is maintained. Meaning that the scenarios with more renewable are more costly than the scenarios with nuclear capacity. And we have tested that also, and even if we take into account that we have a bit of exports, well, it does not change anything on the conclusion. It's not very significant. And we have compared, let's say, those two scenarios that are the more the more meaningful ones. So the one which is called M23 and N2, with different sets of assumptions. I will not enter into the details of all the meaning of the different points, and I could get back on that during this discussion, but the idea was to say, is this conclusion really reliable, and what is its domain of viability? And what we have concluded is that even considering very stressed situation, in particular for the case for the cost of nuclear, well, there is very little configuration in which the situation for renewable scenarios to be less costly than scenarios with at least a bit of nuclear, in order to have a set of dispatchable capacity, but is also opens other kinds of questions that we still are working on, and also other different dimensions that we have looked at, in particular environmental dimension, or also society dimensions, that I would be happy to discuss with you then. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have questions, I welcome them.
Thank you, Vincent, for this very dense presentation of the very large work performed by RT last year and revised almost every week, if I'm correct. So in the chat, there is no clarification questions. Okay. Just let's say more time-consuming questions that we will address at the end of the presentation. So now we can move to the third presentation. So please, Yannick, I think it's...
All right. Thank you very much, Yannick. Let me share my screen. Can you all see it?
Yeah, perfectly.
All right, great. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to this panel, and thank you also for the great previous presentations and the opportunity to talk about how Agora Energiewende, that I represent, burden-based climate and energy policy think tank, how we think that Germany could become climate neutral until 2045, actually. And much of the insights that I will share with you are based on a study that we commissioned together with two partners, Agora Verkehrswende and Stiftung Klimaneutralität, in fall 2020. So the goal of the study was to present a decarbonization pathway to climate neutrality that takes into account costs, technical feasibility, and social acceptance. And the study was written by Prognos, Öko-Institut, and Wuppertal Institute, 3 energy and climate research institutes. And we updated the study in spring last year and modeled another pathway how Germany can become climate neutral already by 2045. And as many of you probably know, the German government last year has decided in the updated climate law that Germany will become climate neutral, and that's legally binding now by 2045. And yeah, the scenario I'm going to present will show you how this could look like. Now, the starting point is, and Monique has already talked about it in detail, the starting point is that Germany has committed to phase out nuclear completely by the end of 2022. And you can see here, just as a summary, the remaining capacity by 2000 going down to 0 by the end of 2022. And let's have a look, a high-level look of how Germany can become climate neutral before we then dive into the details. So essentially, you can see between 1990 and 2020, emissions were already considerably decreased to 739 megatons CO2 equivalents, around 17 megatons per year on average. And now emissions need to further decrease in a first step by 65% compared to 1990, and then by 95% until 2045. And you can see in 2045, we still have residual emissions coming primarily from the agricultural sector, amounting to around 40 megatons. And those will be offset by negative emissions. And in our scenario, that is by the utilization of BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture storage, DACS, direct air capture, CCS, as well as the use of green polymers in the industrial sector. So much as an overview in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction of the scenario. Now, let's look at the 5 central strategies, and I will focus primarily on the power sector for our discussion today. The first strategy was and is the increase of energy efficiency. And you can see here the primary energy consumption between 2018 and 2045. And you can see that we will see, well, at least in our scenario, a considerable decrease by around 50%. And the share of renewable energy will increase dramatically. If you include PTX imports here in light blue, to around 97% in 2045. And the reduction of primary energy consumption is primarily driven by energy efficiency gains across sectors, but in particular in the building sector, where retrofits and efficient appliances even outweigh the introduction of, I think in our scenario, we have 14 million heat pumps. Now, the second strategy, not surprisingly, is the rapid expansion of renewable energies. in our scenario towards 70% renewable energy share in 2030 and 100% by no later than 2045. In terms of installed capacity, you see on the left side that renewable capacity will have to increase by at least a factor of 5. And in terms of net power generation, the biggest contribution eventually will come from PV, followed by onshore wind and offshore wind. And despite the fact that our scenario is already quite ambitious, you can see in this call-out box that the newly elected government is even more ambitious, at least according to the coalition treaty, aiming for 80% renewable energy share by 2030. They have a slightly higher electricity consumption value for 2030. And so that translates to around 550 to 600 terawatt hours of net power generation in 2030, which is, and we'll see that on a later slide, extremely ambitious. Now, let's look a little bit deeper into the power sector. You see here the net power generation and net imports in terawatt hours. And you can see that until 2045, net power generation increases quite strongly as a consequence of increasing electrification and sector coupling. The share of renewable energy increases in line with the numbers I presented on the previous slide. And looking at the time between 2018 to 2030, we talked about it already. Nuclear will be phased out by 2022, the gray part in the 2018 column. But what is also very important for the German discussion is that we have also legally agreed on a coal phase out by no later than 2038. In our scenario, however, lignite and hard coal is already driven out by 2030 by the market as a consequence of both rising ETS carbon prices and low gas prices. Now, the latter part, the low gas prices part, is a little bit at odds with what we see in the current energy crisis and in the current market. And I'll come to that later. But in any way, what is important to see is that the phase out of nuclear and coal in our scenario, but just in general, will have to be offset not only by increasing renewables, the green part, but in particular also by increase in natural gas. And you can see that here in the light gray bluish part, natural gas based electricity production will increase from roughly 80 terawatt hours to 134 terawatt hours in 2030, and then gradually decrease again while hydrogen is phased in, so that in 2045, the gas plants remaining, which you will see on the next slide, are actually quite high, is run on 100% renewable hydrogen. So let's look at capacity of flexible power plants to safeguard energy security in this climate neutrality scenario. As I just mentioned in the left chart, the gas power plant capacity will starkly increase by around 20 gigawatt in 2030, and then by another 30 gigawatt until 2045. Compared with other scenarios for climate neutrality in Germany, this is quite a lot of gas capacity, which for one reason is due to the also comparatively moderate expansion of renewable energy in our scenario. Now on the right side of this chart, you see to add further flexibility alongside increased gas capacity, we have an increase in demand side management capacity and most importantly, battery storage capacity. from 2 gigawatt in 2030 to roughly 50 gigawatt in 2045. And this includes both central storage as well as home storage and pro rata storage of flexible appliances like EVs and heat pumps that can flexibly load on the basis of market signals. All right. The third strategy that is driving the greenhouse gas emission reduction, quite importantly, is the electrification across sectors. Now, you see that in line with net electricity generation, gross power consumption shown here increases significantly to around 1,000 terawatt hours in 2045. And you can see that the biggest contribution comes from the uptake of electric vehicles here in the darker blue, and the production of inland renewable hydrogen, as well as electrification of industry at the very bottom of the chart that also increase, although I have to say that in our scenario, the electrification of industrial processes is lower than in other scenarios, as we have modeled the utilization of bioenergy quite considerably in the industrial sector to achieve negative emissions through the use of BECCS technology, which I will talk a little bit about on a further slide. Interestingly, the power consumption in the building sector will decline despite the fact that by 2030, the scenario foresees 5.6 million heat pumps, and then by 2045, 14 million heat pumps because of energy efficiency gains in the building sector, renovations, and the application of efficient appliances and technologies, lighting, etc. The fourth strategy, I already mentioned it, is the use of hydrogen. In the scenario, we see a total hydrogen demand, CO2-free hydrogen, I must say, of 265 terawatt hours. By 2030, you can see in the light green and green, the biggest part of the hydrogen demand comes from the industrial sector for raw iron production in DRI plants, basic chemicals production, especially ammoniac and other metals. And towards 2045, gradually demand for road freight in the transport sector rises, but most importantly, the majority of renewable hydrogen will go into the power sector, will be phased in gas plants for electricity and district heating production as a flexibility backup, and especially in times of peak load. In terms of hydrogen generation on the right side, you see that this scenario assumes that around 2/3 of renewable hydrogen or CO2-free hydrogen is imported and around 1/3 is produced domestically. The fifth strategy for climate neutrality is, and I just want to mention briefly, the achievement of negative emissions and carbon capture storage. Now, by 2045, we see in this scenario around 60 megatons of residual emissions, and those emissions, primarily coming from the agriculture sector, have to be offset by negative emissions. And in that scenario, that happens in the industry sector through the use of bioenergy, carbon capture storage, as well as in the energy sector by the use of direct air capture, carbon capture storage, to offset these residual 5% of greenhouse gas emissions. So much to the 5 central strategies. Let us just discuss 2-3 challenges that I see, especially in the context of the current energy crisis and also the discussion around nuclear. So how will nuclear and coal in the German context be phased out? That will be phased out, be compensated. We talked about it now, and the short answer is ramping up renewable energies and ramping up flexible gas power plants that will be gradually run with renewable hydrogen. So let us just look at the challenge before the German government in terms of expansion of renewable hydrogen. Because as you can see, the degree to which capacity additions need to be ramped up is just, frankly, insane. In gray, you see the historic capacity additions, left for PV and right for wind onshore. And then you see in the full yellow and full blue, respectively, the tender volumes as per the Renewable Energy Act 2021. And then in the yellow striped and blue striped columns, you see the additional capacity needed to reach the new 80% renewable energy share goal by the government. And of course, this chart or these two charts illustrate quite well the challenge that lies before us. The success of the German energy transition hinges on the uptake of renewable energy, and it's to be seen whether the German government can create the political and legal conditions to really manifest such an increase. In any way, we will see an increase in gas capacity and gas-based electricity production. I showed the left chart already a few slides before. Nuclear will be phased out by 2022. Coal phase out by no later than 2038. And we will see a considerable increase in gas-based electricity production. Now, the question in the current situation is how the energy crisis will impact the energy mix in Germany. And what we have seen in the last year, and that you can get an idea from on the right chart, is that with the gas prices as high as they have been, the power system merit order changed in a way that coal now moved before gas in some times. So we saw a gas to coal switch after years of seeing a coal to gas switch. And from a climate perspective, that's of course, let's call it horrible. And the question really is, if we see high gas prices, how will that continue? It might be that the coal phase out that we have modeled in the scenario will take a bit longer, or that the decrease to, in the short and medium term, to around 2025 will be slower than we have modeled. And we will also have to see, depending on the ramp up of renewable and the success of ramping up renewables, how much gas capacity will be needed, can be utilized, and how fast new gas capacity can also be built in Germany. Yeah, I have this slide with the merit order. I think this goes too much into detail now, but I'm happy to talk and discuss more about that if that's for interest for you. And yeah, ending on a positive note, I think Germany has to chance to continue to make the energy transition, the German Energiewende, successful. But as you could see, it really hinges on the question how fast renewable energy can be ramped up now. Otherwise, the climate results and the greenhouse gas balance of the next years will be not in line with what the German government has legally agreed to do, and we'll see how that works out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation, Yannick. I think we have quite a few questions, but I don't think that these are questions for now. Maybe we can discuss this later on in your joint discussion. Thank you. Okay, our final presentation will be from Arthur Lynch, again from our French sister association.
Yeah, hello. First of all, thank you all for all the organizer and of course the presenter. It was really interesting to have a perspective. Oh, sorry, I think I lost my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen? Yeah. So I'm really happy to present to you a current working paper that is being submitted that talked about nuclear fleet flexibility and the stakes surrounding its modeling and the impact this modeling has on power system estimation with renewable energy. The goal is really to focus on the modeling behind the mixes with viable renewable energies and nuclear energies, which will be probably the mix that we will see in France in the future to reach carbon neutrality. So I don't think I will come back to the context of this study because it has already been presented extensively by the other presenters. But the fact is that in France, and of course in Germany, it was also the case, we will be installing more and more viable renewable capacities in the electricity mix. And this will create a system with strong flexibility, needs. And in this context, the real question is to know what is the role of nuclear energy in such power system. So nuclear energy to accommodate to viable renewable capacity will need to be more flexible than it is already in France. And the question is to define or to determine how modelers should represent nuclear in such future studies. So of course, there were questions that motivated this research. The first one was to determine whether nuclear is flexible. And of course, in France, nuclear has a history of being flexible with, of course, some constraint. Nuclear energy is still less flexible than other mean of generation, thermal mean of generation, I mean. I gave you this example just from last week from the Paluel 1 reactors, and that needed to ramp down due to low energy electricity consumption due to low economic activities because it was a vacation. So we can see that nuclear in France can be flexible in a really short time and can accommodate some part and may accommodate some part of the viable renewable intermittency. The second type of question behind this research was how should we model this flexibility? Modeling nuclear flexibility constraint in a simulation model as a tool on the computational time. So it is really important to determine whether it is necessary to represent it in such simulation model because it may hinder the simulation process. So what we did after that was to determine which kind of flexibility limit we want to represent, and we chose to focus on two main flexibility limits. The first one being maintenance and refilling outages. We, looking at the modeling literature, we found that this is a flexibility limit that is often overlooked, and it refers to the fact that after refilling the fuel, nuclear reactors start their evolution cycle for several months, 12 months or 18 months or 24 months, depending on the electric system and the strategy of the plant manager, and then need to stop to do some maintenance or refilling outages that last for several weeks. The fact that these outages last several weeks is a structural characteristic of nuclear production and nuclear flexibility and may need to be taken into account. If we look at the alternation of production phases and outage phases, what we find is that it's really defined if reactors are able to produce or not, with long production phases and long outage phases, as you can see on this production chronicle of CentraleSupélec 1. The second type of flexibility limits that we decided to look at is minimum power variation. We chose to focus on that because in the modeling literature, we found that minimum power is often represented as constant. And we looking at nuclear physics, at least for pressurized water reactors, it is not the case at all. At the start of the evolution cycle, we find that nuclear reactors have huge flexibility capabilities, and they can ramp down from 100% of the nominal power to 20% of the nominal power. And starting from 2/3 of the evolution cycle, this minimum power starts to increase, and the flexibility capabilities of reactors start to decrease. So it is really important when we want to assess the available flexibility of a nuclear power plant to know what is the state of each reactors in their evolution cycle. If we look at this same plant that I presented to you before, we can clearly see the fact that this minimum power start to increase. So this is really a structural feature of at least French nuclear power plants. Maybe you will ask yourself why in this working paper we did not take into account ramping constraint. Ramping constraints in nuclear reactors range from 2% of nominal power per minute to 5% of the nominal power per minute, meaning that nuclear reactors are less flexible than other means of generation, such as gas or fuel plant. But the fact that we don't take into account this ramping constraint to link to the fact that we only focus on hourly time step simulation model. Now that we determine which kind of flexibility limit we focus on, we want to know how to integrate them in a power system simulation model. So the first one, maintenance and refueling outages, what we found looking at the modeling literature is that it is not often implemented. So there were few literature about how to represent this constraint. And so we decided to build a mixed integral linear program that we built ourselves that aim to replicate the nuclear schedule dynamics. The nuclear schedule dynamics that try to replicate is, of course, the average weekly nuclear availability found in France. That can be found on the right side of the screen. And in France, it's the dynamics are to have a high nuclear availability during the winter and lower during the summer, due to the fact that there is higher electric consumption during the winter for heating needs. Of course, another thing that we take into account in our model to represent maintenance and refueling outages is each reactor's constraint, so irradiation cycle length and outage length. But we also take into account all the parameters that really condition the nuclear schedule optimization process in reality, such as workforce limitation. You cannot stop all reactors at the same time due to safety or to workforce limitation. So if we run our model with different fleet size level, so one with 20 reactors, one with 40 reactors, and one with 60 reactors, for example, we find that our model allows us to replicate the usual nuclear schedule dynamics with higher nuclear availability during the winter and lower during the summer. And if we compare that to the historical nuclear availability, we find that our model, of course, it is not perfect. It does not represent exactly the historical nuclear availability, but as it represents the main characteristic, an higher nuclear availability during the winter and lower during the summer, we find that our model does replicate quite good these dynamics. The second flexibility limit that we implement in our model is, of course, the minimum power level variation. And once we optimized the nuclear schedule, we can know when reactors start the irradiation cycle and when they stop the irradiation cycle. So starting from that, we can evaluate the advancement of each reactors in the irradiation cycle. Thus, we can compute the related minimum power level variation according to the advancement. So this allows us to estimate the overall minimum power of the nuclear fleet, thus the the flexibility capabilities of a nuclear fleet. What we find is that this flexibility capabilities is the difference between the red line and the blue line. And we find that flexibility capabilities of a nuclear fleet are higher during the winter than during the summer, at least for France. If we compare that to assumptions that are commonly found in the modeling literatures, for example, a constant nuclear flexibility, a constant minimum power level based on seasonal nuclear availability, so the dotted line in red, we find that this assumption of constant minimal power does not replicate the dynamics of minimal power, with an underestimation of nuclear flexibility during winter times and a slight overestimation during summer times. If we compare also those assumptions with a common assumption, so this assumption being a constant nuclear availability and a constant minimal power level, what we find is that this assumption to represent nuclear flexibility and nuclear potential to accommodate for variable renewable energies and electric demand variation is not correct at all in terms of estimation of nuclear flexibility. We have a constant underestimation of nuclear flexibility. So now that we determine how to represent nuclear flexibility constraint, we want to make sure that implementing those flexibility constraints in a power system simulation is worth it. So what we did is compare 3 different nuclear flexibility modeling cases. So the first cases being the base cases, case A, where we consider that nuclear flexibility modeling is simplified with a constant nuclear availability and a constant minimum power. The second case, case B, is an enhanced nuclear flexibility modeling, where we consider that we optimize the nuclear schedule, but do keep the minimum power, constant minimum power assumption. And by doing that, we will first compare the case B to case A in order to evaluate the impact of optimizing the schedule of the nuclear fleet, both on the power system simulation result, but also in real life. And lastly, the last case is what we call a realistic nuclear flexibility modeling, where we take into account an optimized nuclear schedule, but also a realistic minimum power variation. And by comparing case C to case A, we can see the impact of modeling the full constraint of nuclear flexibility on the power system simulation result. Of course, we know that modeling nuclear flexibility constraint will not be of the same interest depending on the capacity mix studied. So what we did is have 50 different sensitivity cases with 5 different variable renewable penetration scenarios and 3 different nuclear penetration scenarios. We will be able to determine in which cases it is worth it to integrate new flexibility constraints in our power system simulation. We do run our analysis on a simplified power system simulation. So contrary to the studies presented by Vincent before, that was an European studies, we only simulate one country, France. But the goal is will be later in a later paper to have an European study. But for this study, we only consider one country. We also consider one weather year. So we chose 2006 because we found in the literature that it was the most representative weather year for renewables, and only a few genetic technologies because we did not want to complexify the model and only focus on the interaction between variable renewable energies and nuclear. And of course, because we only focus on one country, there is no interconnection. So we do run our 3 cases in our 15 different capacity scenarios in these countries, and we compare the result. So just to give you an idea on what economic dispatch look like, this is the dispatch in one of our cases where we optimize the nuclear schedule. And the idea is just to show you that, of course, when we don't have variable renewable energies, gas and nuclear is predominant. And when we don't have nuclear, gas and variable renewable energies are dominant. But this is really not the heart of the studies. The heart of the studies is to compare between our 3 different cases of nuclear flexibility modeling. And the first comparison that we did was about operational cost and the impact of modeling nuclear flexibility on the estimation of operational cost. So the first comparison is between case B and case A. So what is the impact of nuclear schedule optimization on simulation result, but also real life? So what we found is that if we optimize the schedule of a nuclear fleet, we have a decrease in the estimation of operational cost. And this decrease is higher when we have high number of nuclear reactors, but also deep variable renewable penetration. If we try to assess what is the impact of representing minimum power variation, we find that it further decreases the estimation of operational cost. And thus, it seems important to take into account this aspect. What we can say when we look at the comparison of those 3 different cases regarding the estimation on operational cost is that it seems quite important to represent the nuclear flexibility constraint in a realistic way in order to have a good estimation of a future power system with renewable energy and nuclear. The second type of characteristics that we try to look at is, of course, direct CO2 emission. Due to the fact that we need to reach carbon neutrality, it is quite important to determine what is the effect of nuclear flexibility on direct CO2 emission. So the impact of optimizing the nuclear schedule was a decrease in CO2 emissions. This is linked to the fact that by having more nuclear flexibility available for the power system simulation, we have a lesser need for gas to balance between the demand and the supply, meaning that it directly decreases the CO2 emissions. And this effect of nuclear schedules optimization is also greater as we have more reactors in the capacity mix and more variable renewable energies. We tried to look also at the impact of minimum power variation and modeling minimum power variation. And what we found is that the additional impact of representing minimal power variation does not really impact the direct CO2 emissions of the system. So what really define the fact that direct CO2 emissions do decrease in our models is the fact that we optimize the schedule, but minimum power variation consideration is secondary. So that's a message related to CO2 emissions. The last main type of result that we try to assess is linked to energy curtailment. Why did we look in energy curtailment? It's because it is one way to measure variable renewable energies integration in the power system. And what we found is that initially, especially in cases with high share variable renewable energies, we have quite significant level of curtailed energies, which of course can be managed, but is a problem in terms of economics and optimality. So what we, when we optimize the nuclear schedule, what we find is that it decreases the estimation of energy curtailment, meaning that optimizing the nuclear schedule does decrease the energy curtailment of variable renewable energies. And this is mostly due to the fact that because we have a higher nuclear availability during the winter, but lower during the summer, the solar production that is really high during the summer is less curtailed. Of course, this effect of nuclear schedule is not significant when we have a low variable renewable penetration, but only when we have variable renewable energy penetration higher than 40% of the electric demand. If we try to assess the additional impact of minimum power variation, what we find is that it further decreases energy curtailment. And because we have a higher nuclear flexibility capabilities, it reduces the curtailment of variable renewable energies. Once again, this effect is only significant when we have more than 40% variable renewable penetration that represent the electric demand. We have other results, but I don't think I will detail them a lot because we run out of time. The first other result is linked to gas output. And in all of our cases where we have higher nuclear availability available, the overall gas production does decrease. This is due to the fact that our systems, because there's no interconnection taken into account, has really huge need of flexibility. And when we have a higher nuclear flexibility available, then gas is less needed to balance between the demand and the supply. Another result is linked to market prices, which is quite important in terms of, especially in cases with high share of variable renewable energies. Nuclear flexibility does decrease the occurrence of negative price arrows in all of our cases. I want to put an emphasis on that due to the fact that when we will, as we will integrate more and more variable renewable energies in capacity mix to decarbonize, we have seen a rising occurrence of negative price hours, which is a big deal in terms of economic viability of generating assets as in an energy-only power system. Another result linked to market price of a working paper is linked to the fact that because we have a reduced gas production, in some of our cases, and especially cases with high nuclear capacity and high variable renewable energy penetration, we find that we have a decreasing occurrence of peaking prices, which further decrease the economic viability of some generating assets. The last type of result that is present in the working paper is linked to technology revenues. We have an increasing technology revenue due to the decreasing occurrence of negative price, which really show the beneficial effect of using nuclear flexibility to accommodate variable renewable energies on the technology revenues. So in the case of hybrid market, this may mean that using nuclear flexibility will decrease such mechanism, the interest of such mechanisms, such as I don't know, capacity mechanisms or other measures that aim to support generating assets. And looking at each technology revenue, we find that the technologies that profit the most from nuclear flexibility is, of course, nuclear, due to the fact that it is one that is able to react to low prices or high variable renewable penetration. So the conclusion of our working papers, that will be my last slide. The first conclusion, and I did not put an emphasis on that, is the fact that in power system with few flexibility needs, it is not necessary to really take into account nuclear flexibility modeling, because nuclear reactors run in baseload mode most of the time. So for most, and this is the case for most countries that currently have nuclear, as nuclear reactors do operate as baseload, then nuclear flexibility is really not a subject and does not really impact the operation of the power system. However, the main conclusion of the paper is the fact that in cases with high nuclear, high flexibility need, so in our cases, it was cases with variable renewable energy penetration higher than 40%. It seemed necessary to include detailed nuclear flexibility constraint because it really influenced simulation result. And by influencing simulation result, it is necessary to highlight the fact that if we try to assess a future situation with variable renewable energy and nuclear, then integrating those constraints is really important. It decreases operational cost estimation, direct CO2 emission estimation, energy curtailment estimation, but also market prices and each technology economic viability. So that's the message of the working paper and the result that we found using our simulation and our newly built schedule optimization model and minimal power variation models. We find that accurately modeling nuclear flexibility is really important in decarbonized power system, with variable renewable energies and nuclear. So I thank you all. I thank you all, and I would be happy to answer to all of your questions, and you could even contact me by mail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for your insightful presentation. Do we have a short question of understanding for Arthur's presentation? Just one comment from our former IAE past president, Christophe Bonnery, that the full paper will be presented on February 1st on the website of the French Association. Okay. Well then, I think that we can go over to our discussion. Maybe all panelists can turn on their cameras for that. I have tried to cluster some of the questions that we got into the chat. Yannick unfortunately has some issues with his internet, but I think that we can continue the discussion as it is. So first of all, thank you very much for all your presentations. We have some lively discussions already going on in the chat and in the Q&A section. So please feel free to add any if you have more questions. So one question goes into a topic which is highly debated when we talk about nuclear energy. It is about the cost of nuclear energy. Especially the presentation from Vincent, people were wondering if the entire life cycle was included in the calculations, where a scenario including new nuclear power plants would be the cheaper options if we take the entire energy system into account. So Vincent, yeah.
Yeah, I understand the question. I think it's a question by Michael Buxted, if I remember well. Indeed, it's well. I understand the question as does it take into account, in particular, the management of nuclear waste and in particular nuclear waste storage and even all the cycle, because in France part of nuclear waste is recycled in order to refuel the nuclear generators, and it's done on quite a long time span. And indeed, it's taken into account with conservative assumptions, and also we have taken we have made a sensitivity analysis in order to be sure that it is not a very let's say a very important driver in the comparison between the scenarios. And so yes, it's taken into account, and even taking quite a very important cost with this regard. It does not change, it reduces the difference between the scenarios with a high amount of renewable compared to scenarios where there is new nuclear reactors. But nevertheless, there is still a difference that remains, in particular because of the flexibility needs, and also because of the impact it has on the need for adapting the network. Because at least in France, the renewable resources, in particular wind resources, they are quite far from the load centers, and also we have all the wires in order to connect the offshore windmills, which is quite costly and which need to be taken into account into the analysis.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Maybe mirroring the question to the German side, we had some questions about whether or not the substitution of nuclear power plants by renewable power plants and some gas-fired power plants operating on hydrogen. There was a question by which will be installed in Germany according to the Agora study. Have you included the cost on the impact of the grid in your studies? Because I was wondering about the impacts of this installation on the German power grid. Yannick?
I have to say I didn't get the question, the first part. Could you repeat that? I couldn't hear you, the first part of what you said.
Sorry, the question would be whether or not in your analysis the cost of expanding the power grid due to the strong increase in renewables have been included, and yeah.
So unlike Vincent, we haven't done a full economic analysis, but what we have done is we looked at the costs of the different energy sources, including the expansion of the grid, and put that as a sort of bottom-up, or concluded a sort of bottom-up analysis. Now, the starting point was a bit different, as for our analysis, there was not really the question whether we continue, for example, to have nuclear in the system. That was exogenous given.
Thank you very much. And quite a few questions went into the area of energy imports in Germany, with having phased out nuclear soon and then also coal. The question is on the dependencies on energy imports in Germany, especially with hydrogen, but also electricity, etc., from neighboring countries, or not even neighboring countries when we talk about hydrogen and ammonia. And maybe to the German side, the question to Yannick and Munib, how can this be guaranteed that this will be feasible in the future, and what are the implications for affordability and security of supply?
I can go first. So it's true, what we see in the modeling results is that Germany becomes a net importer after being a net exporter of electricity for many years, despite, I have to add, on a low level, a net importer. I'm not very sure the countries that contribute in which order to this net import of electricity by 2045. But it's also true that in a scenario with 265 terawatt hours of hydrogen, that's of course a considerable amount that we assume. They are of around 2/3, 170 terawatt hours imported. And we have not modeled where these hydrogen imports come from and which preconditions have to be met in countries exporting these volumes of hydrogen to Germany. But what we see, and that is maybe connected to that question, is I think I saw a question that was going into that direction, that the German government is now really actively pushing for creating these conditions in the Northern African countries, in the Middle East, in Southern Europe. There has just been the H2 Global program, 900 million that will be spent on a sort of double auction mechanism to buy international hydrogen and then sell it domestically. But it is, and that's true, an open question, how these import volumes can be ensured.
Yeah, maybe to add on that, most studies and projections see some kind of scarcity in the German system that needs to be fixed. So you can do that either with imports of renewable energy carriers, or you can do this with imports of electricity. And just as you said, Yannick, it is not 100% clear what is going to happen. It's just still an open question whether we will go either more on the hydrogen side or whether we will go for electricity imports, but there is this scarcity that we are going to run into.
Yeah, another question which has been addressed a couple of times is regarding the energy efficiency being a key strategy for sustainable energy future. Actually, this has been addressed with regards to both countries in the chat. Is the goal realistic to reduce the primary energy consumption? Well, I think it was the final energy consumption by 40%, 50% in the next 2-3 decades. The rebound effect has been cited, for instance, and I think the questions were addressed to Vincent and to Yannick.
Well, for instance, in our modeling, so this rebound effect is taken into account based on what we can observe today. For instance, in the heating sector, but also more broadly on the use of specific electricity. So all the appliances you have in your home, or for instance for light. Which is a major sector where we had see a very important increase in energy efficiency with a rebound effect, because since light is less costly, you install more lights in your home to have more light as a whole, more light bulbs. So this exists. For heating, the rebound effect is more important than in other sectors in which are already electrified, and it decreased. In our modeling, more or less, we considered that it decreased the energy efficiency by a third, but it depends a lot on the houses and on the revenues of their occupants, because when you have less revenues, you are in a situation when you decrease a lot your use of electricity, your use of your heating needs, in order to cope with your revenue constraints. So once you have an increase in energy efficiency, in fact, it helps you to have a better heating process in your home, and so to increase your comfort. And I think this is the kind of benefit that that also need to be taken into account, because it has benefits not only from the point of view of comfort, but also from the point of view of health, for children education, things like that. And so there is a bit of literature with this regard, but this has to be taken into account also in the evaluation of abatement costs, because there is also co-benefits of this kind of thing. But that's true that, let's say it's taken into account, but at least technically it can be taken into account. And then from an economic perspective, I think it's broader than only looking at the energy system.
Yannick, do you agree from the German side, or do you have another perspective on this?
Yeah, maybe just to mirror that, I totally agree. And I mean, if you look at the greenhouse gas emission reductions in the building sector in Germany and the efficiency gains, then it was, it was not that good in the last years, despite the fact that the German government has spent millions of euros in the sector. And I think the main reason is that, first of all, the efficiency standards that had to be met to gain government funding were not yet very ambitious. They are more ambitious now when you look in the coalition treaty, but in our thinking, not yet of where we have to move towards to. And then at the same time, the the technology used, heat pumps in particular, have also potential to further develop and become more efficient. And yeah, I mean, most importantly, the renovation rate is not yet there where it needs to be. And I think if you combine these factors, then the efficiency gains that our research partners have modeled are achievable despite being quite ambitious. That's true. I think it's the most challenging sector to actually see the reductions that we need to see.
Thank you very much. There was a very interesting question regarding the flexibility of nuclear power plants, and I think this question goes to Arthur. And the question was, why not look into other providers of flexibility instead of nuclear power plants in France? Why not have the nuclear power plants run on the nominal production and add other providers for flexibility, such as demand side management, flexible hydrogen and electricity exports, etc.
Yes, thank you. Of course, in most countries, this is the case. Nuclear power plants do run as baseload, but mostly due to the fact that they do not represent a huge share of the capacity mix, so it is not necessary for them to be flexible. Historically, in France, nuclear has already been flexible due to the fact that it represents a high share of capacity. High share in the capacity mix, meaning that it was necessary for it to be flexible to accommodate for demand variation. So the question is really not to try to know whether we need to run nuclear power plants at full power or to use them flexibly. But in France, it is just something that has to be done due to the fact that we have a huge nuclear capacity. In the future, due to the fact that we will have more and more viable renewable energies, the residual demand will most probably decrease and become more and more variable. So if nuclear reactors want to remain in the capacity mix, they will need to be flexible. Otherwise, if we only want nuclear power plants that run at in baseload mode, then it will decrease the nuclear capacity. In the future, I guess we have to think about that. Nuclear will partially compete again other flexibilities. And we will try to assess what is the most optimal flexibility to use. So is it optimal to use demand side management, or is it optimal to use nuclear flexibility? I think that is one question that we'll need to answer like later, I guess. So nuclear flexibility, I think, will be necessary, and of course. For example, export. Like I see that the question mentioned the export and the potential output that will probably increase the capacity factor for nuclear power plants. But due to the fact that, for example, Germany, for example, does integrate more and more viable renewable energies, it will necessarily impact the French system. And the French system will need to accommodate for viable renewable energies in France, but also from neighboring countries, and Germany is part of that. So this will be a necessity. I think I was a little bit too long, sorry.
Oh, good. I think we will discuss two more questions due to time constraints. The first one, which has been addressed in the chat quite frequently, I would say, is the question of the substitution of nuclear power plants for the flexibility reasons here in Germany and other power plants with gas power plants in light of the recent gas crisis. So are gas power plants really suitable? to provide the necessary flexibility in the German energy system in light of the recent gas crisis? Maybe to Yannick and maybe Munib, if you want to answer.
Yeah, Munib, you want to go first this time?
Yeah, so in Germany, we do not have much of a choice. It's just as simple as that. We are leaving coal, we're leaving nuclear, and gas is what remains. It has, though, the upside potential that it could be used with green gases in the future, like hydrogen, and the power plants that we are going to build now are supposed to be hydrogen ready. And basically the plan is that we will not need these in the far future when we are going towards a decarbonized world. We are not using, we will not be using these plants massively. So and there will be large capacities, but not so much electricity generation from it, only in times where we just desperately need it. And so it would also be possible then to use a fuel that is expensive, like a green or a renewable fuel.
Okay, thank you. Yannick, do you want to add on that, or?
Yeah, just to mirror what Munib said, I totally agree. I think in our modeling, the average full load hours of the hydrogen run gas power plants in 2045 is just 1,000 full load hours, something like that, around that size. So it's really just in peak times and in winter. And yeah, as Munib said, there is not much of a choice. But of course, if gas prices remain high and coal partially continues to be before gas in the merit order, it will just be more costly in the short and medium term. But I think medium to long term, from a flexibility perspective, that's totally sufficient.
Okay, maybe just briefly to the German side, again, there's a question by Elizabeth. Is there any chance the 3 remaining reactors will not be closed? What do you think?
No.
No,
I explained the mechanism, and it is codified in German law that these plants will lose their permit for power operation by the end of the year. And this is not reversible, because once you lose this permit, you will not regain the permit again. That is more or less impossible, because you would have to prove and apply for a new permit, like you would have to apply for a new plant, and these plants are not new. So it's just not. It is more or less impossible legally. You would have to change the law during this year, and no serious party in Germany would do that.
Okay, thank you. So the final point, we are a bit over time. Can we briefly touch the topic of risk sharing? Both security of supply and nuclear accidents will most likely be shared among Germany and France. This is a question by Emil Kraft. So maybe for all the panelists, yes, we are neighboring countries, and on the one hand, with Germany going out of nuclear, I think the question implies that there will be an issue for security of supply for also France by this German decision. On the other hand, by continuing to use nuclear power plant, there's the risk of nuclear accidents, which will also be carried by Germany. So maybe some comments on that, final comments.
Want to go first?
Please, Arthur, go on.
I don't think nuclear safety is a specialty of anyone there. But in terms of payment for accident, I think, for example, Germany will go out of nuclear, so it is not a problem. It will not be a problem in the future, at least. The term of payment after an accident, I think the one that has to pay is EDF, up to 700 million, I guess. And then further payment will be made by the state. So on this point, I think it's quite clear that that Germany would not be impacted, at least in fact, financially. And
maybe the question can be actually rephrased: are national energy policies still timely? Maybe also given the fact that we are part of the European Union, would it not be more simpler and make more sense to have a common energy policy strategy instead of two separate, and then maybe while we share common risks, that we should also have a common strategy?
I'm not sure. I mean, we share common targets, and the individual nations are then supposed to sort out their own plans. I agree that we should collaborate closer. I mean, it's obvious for things like the electricity grid, where there would be a huge benefit having European solutions. But I'm not sure if it's a good idea to, let's say, to have a common policy, although the attitudes and the situations of the different nations are so different. You cannot say, you cannot just force everybody to do the same thing. It would basically take away the freedom of the nations to decide for themselves. And concerning the risk of accidents or maybe outage or whatever, economic or other risks, it has always been like that. I mean, we are neighbors, but at the same time, we have to guarantee also our neighbors that they have the freedom to decide for themselves what to do, as long as they comply with all the regulations.
One way to move forward, maybe on this topic, is to think about the fact that everybody can do the policy he wants, but we can also think about a nuclear policy made of something like a European guideline, knowing that if you want to make a new nuclear, these are the rules to follow. If you want to stop, this is the rule to follow. And if you want to decommission, this is the rule to follow. So maybe we cannot decide for each of the country which is the size of the nuclear they should adopt, because it's a national decision. Whereas once you have choose the nuclear, it could be an European process or a European scheme that you have to apply to reduce the cost, to have all the benefits of having a single frame for EU, which is not forcing people to choose, but once the technology is chosen, to reduce the cost by having a standard.
And to complete the two interventions, now the countries are obliged to consult their neighbors with regard to their national low carbon strategy when they publish it or when they adjust it. And I think that's also the moment where the neighbors can react and for instance, raise the question that was mentioned there. That's for sure that let's say when you're in a consultation process where you put the boundary, well, it puts also the boundary of the analysis, but this is for the liability of states, of national states with this regard.
Okay, if there are no more comments from our panelists, I thank you very much for your very insightful presentation, for this very interesting discussion, and also to the audience. Thank you very much for your participation also in the discussion and strong involvement. Thanks a lot. So Rebecca, back to you.
IAEE wishes to thank Yannick Perez and Erin Pratinko and our distinguished panelists for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you're not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.